What's up, everyone? So, before we dive into today's educational content, I just need to share some important disclaimer information. So, this video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute a medical, psychological, or therapeutic advice. The information presented here is purely based on peer-reviewed research and is intended to increase awareness, curiosity, understanding, things like that. Individual experiences are going to vary greatly. So if you're struggling with trauma, you got some mental health concerns, please consult with a qualified mental health professional for really more personalized guidance. This content does not establish a therapeutic relationship between you and I. I'm simply sharing the information as a licensed professional providing educational content only. So if you're in crisis, remember the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 988, and the crisis text line is texting home to 741-741 or any of your local emergency services. So now that that's out the way, Hmm. Today, we are going to explore the fifth, I'll say the fifth, perhaps one of the most profound types of spiritual trauma from this five series educational component, and it's the sacred womb trauma. This one is deeply personal for me because I imagine you might be watching this and you might have questions that come up along the way. And I know in my own reflections, I remember the moment when my own sacred wound was trauma wound was really created. And I think I was around about 10 years old, and I was sitting in a friend's church when I witnessed something that shattered my understanding of spiritual safety forever. Without going into the details that really aren't mine to share, I watched as someone I trusted deeply, a spiritual mentor who had taught me about divine love and protection for many years of attending this particular church, revealed themselves to be capable of this profound cruelty and manipulation. In that moment, something just broke inside of me that took many decades to understand and heal. It wasn't just disappointment, you see, or even betrayal in the conventional sense. It was a complete collapse of my ability to trust the sacred could be safe, that spiritual connection could be pure, that divine love could be real. I felt like I had been cast out of Eden, the Garden of Eden, not by God, but by the very people who claim to represent God. What I didn't know then was that I had experienced what researchers now recognize as sacred wound trauma, a form of spiritual injury that occurs when our deepest spiritual beliefs, our sacred relationships, or connection to the divine, they're just violated, betrayed, or even corrupted. This creates what Dr. Judith Herman calls a challenge to become theologians, philosophers, as we juggle to rebuild our entire understanding of meaning, safety, and spiritual truth. Research shows that sacred wound trauma affects people differently based on gender, cultural background, and specific nature of their spiritual betrayal, let's say. Today, we're going to explore what science tells us about this profound form of trauma, how it manifests differently across genders, and what research suggests about the path towards healing. So stay tuned. There's some really good information here. And hopefully you'll be able to get through the entire video. So let's start with the scientific foundation. While sacred wound trauma isn't yet widely recognized, particularly in Western mainstream psychology, the underlying phenomena are well documented through research on complex trauma, betrayal trauma, of what researchers called sacred dissonance. And it was Dr. Judith Herman's Research around 1992 established the complex trauma fundamentally affects our belief system and spirituality. You see, her work shows that trauma or traumatic events challenge survivors to really articulate things like values and beliefs that trauma has destroyed, forcing them to really reconstruct their entire worldview about safety, meaning, even divine connection. Research, in particular, recent research tells us from complex trauma resources which identifies sacred dissonance as the conflict between past spiritual beliefs and current trauma experiences, between the desire for a spiritual connection and the fear of further betrayal, and between cultural spiritual traditions and, let's say, personal healing needs. One of the most significant research findings came from Tang and Freyd's 2012 research, which, when I looked at it, was cited in over 165 times. That's pretty significant. What they discovered that betrayal trauma, trauma inflicted by someone we depend on for the survival or our well-being, explains why women report higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than men. Now, this is particularly relevant to sacred wound trauma because spiritual leaders and communities often hold these positions of profound trust and dependency. However, in a surprising 2021 study by Sogard and colleagues, and it was only cited about 27 times, found something unexpected. In clinical populations, and those are people actually seeking treatment, and these were men with victimization trauma reported to kind of have more severe symptoms than the women in several key areas. And some of those key areas where men were more symptom presentation, intrusive symptoms, difficulty regulating emotions, negative self-perception, problems in relationships, and alterations in systems of meaning. So this kind of suggests that while women may be more likely to experience the betrayal trauma, when men do experience it, particularly in these spiritual contexts, the impact of their core belief system may even be more profound. So, to my men out there, there's help available for you as well if you're ready to just dive into some of this. And another research published in 2022 by Jones and colleagues, and it cited about 90 citations, examined religious trauma specifically with the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and plus populations. What they found was that conversion practices and religious rejection created particularly severe forms of sacred wound trauma associated with increased abuse, medical or mental health diagnosis, and suicidality. Wow. This research helps us understand how sacred wound trauma intersects with identity and authenticity in just these profound ways that hopefully we're starting to really appreciate more. And then there was a 2024 study that found in 1 in 3 Americans suffered from religious trauma. 1 in 3 Americans suffer from religious trauma. I'm not going to tell you that is the same statistics for sexual abuse. And there's not specific treatment for this. That's the crazy part. With disproportionately impacting the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning community members. This suggests that sacred wound trauma is far more common than previously recognized, affecting millions of people who may not even have the language or even the recognition of this experience. So let's talk a little bit more about these gender differences. What exactly is sacred wound trauma? Based on the research that I reviewed, I understand it as trauma that occurs within an individual's deepest spiritual beliefs. The sacred relationships or connection to the divine are violated. They're betrayed or they're corrupted. Unlike other forms of trauma that might affect our sense of safety in the world, sacred wound trauma affects our sense of safety in the universe itself. So let that sit in for a little bit, because that's a bigger concept to take in. Research even reveals that there are distinct gender patterns in how sacred wound trauma develops and manifests. And these patterns, they're not absolute. These tendencies are, I guess, they're tendencies that research has identified across different populations. For women, research shows several common sacred wound patterns. First, women are statistically more likely to experience betrayal by spiritual authority figures. Studies consistently show that women more frequently experience abuse by these trusted religious leaders, creating profound sacred wound trauma that affects their ability to, let's say, trust spiritual guidance or authority. And second, research identifies what might be called divine feminine suppression wounds. Many spiritual traditions have historically suppressed feminine spiritual power and authority. When women internalize messages that they are superior, spiritually inferior, less capable of divine connection, or meant to be spiritually submissive, this creates wounds about spiritual agency and personal spiritual authority. And third, studies show that religious teachings that shame the female body create what researchers call body-spirit disconnection wounds. This is one that kind of still sticks with me to this day in terms of in spiritual communities, how women's bodies tend to be objects or parts of conversations. When spirituality is used to shame sexuality, menstruation, childbirth, or even female embodiment, women may develop sacred wounds around the integration of their physical and, let's say, their spiritual selves. For men, though, research reveals different, but let's say equally significant patterns. Studies show that cultural restrictions on male emotional and spiritual expression can create wounds around that authentic spiritual connection. Let's say men are often taught to, or are often taught that spirituality should be, let's say, intellectual rather than emotional, strong rather than vulnerable, which can create these internal conflicts when genuine spiritual experiences involves things like surrender, emotion, receptivity, things like that. You know, research identifies something called the spiritual warrior trauma in men. And that's pressure to embody strength and protection in spiritual contexts without permission to process vulnerability or fear. When men are expected to be these spiritual leaders or protectors, but aren't really given space to maybe acknowledge their own spiritual wounds or needs, this can create that internal sacred trauma. Additionally, studies show that betrayal by, let's say, our parental authority figures, and whether that's biological fathers or father figures in religious contexts, creates particular wounds in men's relationships to what many traditions call the divine masculine or paternal aspects of the divine. And so, for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning community and gender diverse individuals, research reveals unique forms of sacred wound trauma. In 2022, the Jones study, which was a comprehensive evaluation at the University of Nebraska's research project, and it showed that rejection by religious communities create wounds around divine acceptance and authentic identity. When individuals receive messages that their true gender identity or sexual orientation is spiritually unacceptable, this creates profound conflicts between authenticity and spiritual connection. Research shows that gender diverse individuals often experience what researchers called gender microaggressions in these religious spaces, subtle but persistent messages that their gender expression is sexually inappropriate or dangerous. And this creates ongoing sacred wound trauma that affects their ability to, let's say, experience spiritual communities and support in more loving, welcoming ways. So let me See, I wanted to think of a way to illustrate how sacred wound trauma develops and manifests across different genders. Let me share, let's say, an educational composite of different patterns that I've observed in research and in clinical literature. And I want to emphasize that this represents really a fictional example created for educational purposes only, but I'm combining elements from various research studies, okay? So let's meet Alex, a 28-year-old who contacted me after watching the original video of my 5 types of spiritual trauma. Alex was raised by a progressive Christian household where they felt deeply connected to their faith and their spiritual community. As a child, Alex experienced what they described as profound spiritual experiences, moments of feeling deeply, let's say, connected to the divine and presence. However, when Alex began questioning their gender identity in adolescence, their spiritual world began to fracture. The same religious leaders who had nurtured Alex's spiritual gifts began sending subtle but clear messages that gender questioning was spiritually dangerous. Alex told that their spiritual experiences might be deception if they continued exploring gender identity. Dive or that authentic divine connection requires acceptance their God-given biological sex. This for Alex, created what research identifies as classic sacred wound trauma because Alex began to experience what researchers call sacred dissonance, the painful conflict between their authentic spiritual experiences and the religious conditional acceptance, the religious community's conditional acceptance. They started questioning whether their genuine spiritual experiences had been real, whether they were worthy of divine love, whether exploring their authentic gender identity meant losing their connection to the sacred. By adulthood, Alex exhibited several patterns that research associates with sacred wound trauma. God, I couldn't get that word out. They experience what studies called spiritual hypervigilance, constant scanning spiritual environments for signs of rejection or conditional acceptance. They develop what research called, or at least terms, divine abandonment fears. The terror that exploring their authentic identity would result in losing divine love and protection. Alex also experienced what researchers identified as spiritual identity fragmentation, feeling like they had to choose between their authentic gender identity and their spiritual connection, as if these core aspects of themselves were incompatible. Research shows that sacred wound trauma often creates what scholars call alterations in systems of meaning, fundamental changes in how individuals understand purpose, safety, and connection in the universe. Alex described feeling like they were spiritually homeless, unable to trust religious communities, but also unable to abandon this really deep spiritual nature. This case illustrates how sacred wound trauma differs from other forms of spiritual trauma. While religious institutional trauma may affect trust in religious institutions and organizations, the spiritual bypassing trauma might affect the use of spiritual practices. It's sacred wound trauma that affects the very core of spiritual identity and connection. Okay, I just got to clear my throat a little bit because now we're getting to how the Octaves method can be used in terms of navigating this trauma. And so, there's research on complex trauma, and it consistently shows that healing sacred wound trauma requires approaches that address multiple dimensions of well-being simultaneously. This aligns with what I call the Octaves method, a frame that really suggest ways to support individuals working on things such as sacred wound trauma. Studies on post-traumatic growth show that sacred wound trauma, while devastating, can also become a path to what researchers call post-traumatic spiritual growth. Deeper, more authentic spiritual connection that really integrates both the light and the shadow aspects of the spiritual experience. So, let me walk you through how research would suggest each area of the Octaves method can support someone working with sacred wound trauma. Remember, this is for educational information only. And, this isn't just it's not a form of treatment recommendations, but there are some practical activities you can play with. So, observation, and that is your spiritual health. Research on mindfulness and trauma shows that developing the ability to observe your own spiritual experiences versus, let's say, these inherited spiritual beliefs is crucial for healing sacred wounds. Studies suggest that practices like meditation, contemplative prayer, spiritual journeying can help individuals distinguish between, let's say, their authentic spiritual connection and their conditioned spiritual responses. Practice activities might include daily spiritual check-ins, exploring different spiritual traditions with some ways of and space to process that and have deeper experience with it, or working with spiritual direction that honors the authentic experience. And then there's C. And I kind of think of this as like, how can we, C is for compassion and bringing that compassion back into ourselves. And research on self-compassion with Dr. Christian Neff's work shows that sacred wound trauma often involves profound spiritual shame and self-criticism. Studies suggest that developing self-compassion, specifically around spiritual experiences, can really help to heal the internalized spiritual criticism that sacred wounds create. Practice activities might include, loving kindness meditation focused on the spiritual journey, writing compassion letters to your younger spiritual self, or you know what I'm going to say, even your older spiritual self, or exploring spiritual traditions that emphasize things like divine love and compassion. And then there's the T for therapy. And research, I can't tell you, consistently shows how sacred wound trauma often requires specialized therapeutic support to understand both the trauma and the spirituality. Studies suggest that approaches like trauma-informed spiritual direction, somatic therapy that includes spiritual dimensions, and therapies that address betrayal trauma can be particularly helpful. Practice activities might include working with trauma-informed spiritual counselors, exploring maybe some body-based spiritual practices, or engaging in therapeutic approaches that honor your spiritual nature. And then there's the A for animals and the playfulness. Our inner child, our hormonal health is also a part of that. Research on play therapy and animal-assisted intervention shows particularly benefits for this healing of the sacred wound, which often involves the loss of spiritual innocence and wonder. So, studies suggest that reconnecting with the playful, curious aspects of spirituality can help restore what trauma researchers, Dr. Peter Levine, who's big in the trauma field, calls spiritual resilience. Practicing activities that might include spending time in nature as spiritual practice, exploring creative spiritual expressions like art or music, or working with animals as spiritual companions and teachers. I just completed my telepathic spiritual communication course, and it's a beautiful experience for me. A lot of laughing going on there. And then there's the V for victims, and that is our nutritional health. Research on trauma and nutrition shows that sacred wound trauma often affects our relationship with nourishment and embodiment. Studies suggest that healing sacred wounds might involve this idea of reclaiming the body as sacred rather than, ooh, shameful. And food as a blessing rather than a temptation. Practicing activities that might involve mindful eating as spiritual practices, exploring cultural foods that connect you to, let's say, ancestral spirituality, or working with nutrition that supports the nervous system regulation during spiritual healing. It's all a win, win, win all the way around. You gotta love this stuff. And then there's the E for exercise, and that is our physical health. And research consistently shows how the sacred wound trauma often involves disconnection from the body as a site of spiritual experience. Studies suggest that gentle, mindful movement can help restore the integration of body and spirit that sacred wounds often fragment. So practicing activities might include things like yoga and qigong, even a walking or moving meditation, walking or moving in nature, or dance as a spiritual expression and embodiment. I think that's my next adventure will be the dance aspect of my expression. And so then there's S for socialize. And this is about relationships. But more and deeply as important, it's the relationship with the self. Research emphasizes that healing sacred wound trauma often requires developing a healthy relationship with your own spiritual authority, while also finding safe spiritual communities to align with. Studies suggest that this involves both the inner work on spiritual self-trust and the outer work on finding or creating spiritual communities that really can honor authentic spiritual diversity. Practices or practicing activities might include developing personal spiritual practices independent of any institution, exploring spiritual communities that affirm your authentic identity, or even creating spiritual social networks with others who understand sacred wound healing. Those are some really great options. Let's kind of talk a little bit more about these gender-specific healing patterns. Research reveals that healing from sacred wound trauma often involves or will follow this kind of gender-specific pattern. These aren't absolute, but rather tendencies that studies have identified. So just kind of keep that in mind. Um, in general, for women, research suggests that healing often involves reclaiming spiritual authority and reconnecting with what various traditions call the divine feminine. Studies show that women with sacred wounds often benefit from exploring spiritual traditions that really honor feminine spiritual power, developing personal spiritual practices that don't require maybe external validation, and healing the split between the body and the spirit that many religious traditions probably created. So then there's, in general, for men, research indicates that healing often involves developing permission for spiritual vulnerability and emotional expression. Isn't that kind of what we've been talking about? Studies suggest that men with sacred wounds often benefit from exploring spiritual practices that honor both strength, ooh, and surrender. Finding spiritual communities that welcome authentic emotional expression and healing relationships with spiritual authority figures. And so for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning community, and gender diverse individuals, research shows that healing often requires this integration of authentic identity with spiritual connection. Studies suggest that this involves finding or creating spiritual communities that affirm gender or diverse gender and sexual identities, and developing these spiritual practices that kind of honor your authentic self. The and healing the false choice between spiritual connection and authentic identity. They're not separate. So, research across all genders show that healing sacred wound trauma often involves what scholars call spiritual individuation. And that really is developing your own authentic relationship with the sacred, the divine, with God. And that may be different from family or friends or other cultural, spiritual traditions, but still honoring what serves you from those traditions. So, how do we move forward? The research we've explored today suggests that sacred wound trauma is a profound form of spiritual injury that affects millions of people with distinct patterns across different genders and identities. But the research is clear and consistently shows us that it isn't a sign of spiritual weakness or failure. It's often the result of a spiritual system that hasn't learned to hold the full complexity of human experiences and authentic spiritual diversity. So, research indicates that healing is not only possible, but that it can lead to what scholars call this post-traumatic spiritual growth, spiritual connection that is deeper, more authentic, more resilient than what existed before the wound. So, studies suggest that individuals who heal sacred wound trauma often become more powerful spiritual teachers and learn to heal themselves, using their experience to create safer spiritual spaces for others. The key research findings suggest that several important points in moving forward. First, education and awareness is crucial. Understanding that sacred wound trauma is a real phenomena and can awareness and bringing about awareness is so crucial. Understanding that sacred wound trauma is this real phenomenon, but it also can help reduce the idea or pressure of spiritual shame and isolation that often accompanies it. And then second, finding trauma-informed spiritual support is essential. Healing sacred wound trauma often requires guides to understand both trauma and spirituality. Then there's the third. Developing your own authentic spiritual authority is vital. Research shows that healing involves learning to trust your own spiritual experience and discernment. Studies often also emphasize the importance of spiritual community that honors diversity and authenticity. Research suggests that healing sacred wounds often involves finding and, let's say, creating spiritual spaces where your authentic self is not just, let's say, tolerated, but celebrated as part of a sacred diversity of creation. That's pretty powerful. So, if you recognize yourself in today's educational content, remember that this is only for educational purposes. Individual experiences are going to vary greatly, and professional support from trauma-informed spiritual counselors or therapists may be helpful for addressing sacred wound trauma. Once again, if you're in immediate crisis, reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 988. You can text the crisis text line at 741-741. Texting home, and you'll get some information for that. Also, if you are part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning and other community, and you want other information and resources and things like that, I always suggest the Trevor Project. They have a crisis support that's available 24 hours, 7 days a week. The number is 1-866-488-7386. All this information will be in the link. For those interested in learning more about complex trauma and spirituality, the Complex Trauma Resources website is excellent educational materials. The research articles that I've referenced today, including Dr. Judith Herman's foundational work on recent studies of betrayal trauma and gender differences, are also available through academic databases. Remember, this video is part of an educational series on the 5 types of spiritual trauma that psychology doesn't recognize. And you can find the original overview video where I introduce all 5 types. And I encourage you to explore other videos in this series for a comprehensive understanding of these important topics. Remember, if you've experienced sacred wound trauma, your spiritual nature isn't broken. It isn't damaged beyond repair. Research consistently shows that with proper understanding, support, time, patience, sacred wounds can become sacred wisdom. Your authentic spiritual connection is not only possible, but may become more beautiful and resilient than you've ever imagined before. The world needs people who have transformed their sacred wounds into sacred wisdom, who can hold space for others' spiritual complexity and authentic spiritual diversity. Your healing journey isn't just about you, it's about creating a world where spiritual connection can be safe, authentic, and life-giving for all people. Thank you for joining me for this educational exploration. If this content was helpful, please consider subscribing to support more of my research-based educational content. And remember, your sacred wound can become your sacred gift to the world. Mine did.